Why are Africans destroying African auto manufacturers? Hello, my name is Collie Brown. Welcome to Africa Business Channel. Before we answer that question, let's take a look at how the automobile industry is structured. Typically, when you see a car or any vehicle with the name on it, that's the manufacturer. That's the company that creates that car. But cars and vehicles generally are made of multiple components, lots of components. And a significant chunk of these components are manufactured not by the main manufacturer, but by subcontractors. Now, in the case of the United States, you have Ford, Chrysler, and GM, and they have lots of sub-manufacturers or subcontractors that make parts all over the United States. In the case of Nigeria, you have Innoson Motors, you have Nord Automobile, and in those cases, their subcontractors are all over Nigeria, not just in the south, not just in the east, it's all over Nigeria. So you can imagine lots of these subcontractors. In fact, some of these subcontractors, the majority of the stuff they produce go to one or two automobile manufacturers. In other words, some 90 or sometimes 100% of the components these subcontractors create go to the assembly plant. And the manufacturer will take these components along with the components they create and put them in an assembly plant and assemble the vehicle. And that's what you see. So it's a distributed environment. But what that means is that if there is a slowdown, in other words, there's not enough demand for vehicles, it means that not just Nord or Innoson companies are going to suffer. All the downstream suppliers are going to be in a world of hurt because their market has basically dried up. And so again, in Nigeria's case, those components are scattered throughout the country. So you can't just say it's a southern car or an eastern car. It's all over the place. So it's important that all of us understand that the automobile manufacturing sector is a distributed environment. And let's not get focused on just the name brand or the company you see who's up front. Now, let's talk about, now that you understand that, let's talk about how Africans are destroying the African automakers. It's been destroyed in two levels, at the government policy level and by the African population, you and I. Now, to illustrate the problems of government policy, African government policy, let's take a look at Southeast Asia. Because Southeast Asia, that is, we're going to give you the names of the countries, but Southeast Asian governments also are in the manufacturing business, manufacturing of automobiles specifically. And they have government policy. So we want to see how their government policy stack up against African government policy. So the countries we're going to look at are China, South Korea, Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam. How do they handle this? So let's take a look at China, for example. If you look at a picture of Beijing 40 years ago, 45 years ago, you saw an awful lot of bicycles. The Chinese government decided that they were going to eventually ramp up the vehicle manufacturing scale, but they started off with bicycles. And what the government policy was is that, in fact, they made it very difficult for you or anyone to bring in and to import bicycles that could compete with the local manufacturers. And what this did was it protected the local manufacturers. They didn't have to compete head-on with more advanced and sophisticated manufacturers in Europe and elsewhere, and Japan and so on and so forth. So government policy restricted, they didn't allow any kind of dumping, and they made sure that their local industry had a fighting chance. Now, if you look at a picture of China from, say, 30 years ago, 25 years ago, you saw a lot of motorcycles. And they're gradually going up the chain, as you can see. But these motorcycles benefit from the same government policy. In other words, the Chinese government made it very difficult for importers, whether they are local importers or outside importers, from bringing in large quantities of vehicles to compete in the Chinese market. This ensured that the Chinese manufacturers of these motorcycles had a protected market. They could hone their craft and improved their manufacturing processes. Then if you look at, fast forward a few more years to say 10 years ago, 12 years ago, 15 years ago, you saw the emergence of the automobile. Lots of vehicles, cars started to show up on the road. And the government kept the same policy. They kept the same exact policy. In other words, they protected their local market. No American company or Japanese company or any company could just walk right in and import lots of vehicles. Frankly, they made it so difficult that even if you wanted to go there and manufacture vehicles, they made sure that you had to partner with a local partner so that you didn't come in and overwhelm their markets. Now, when we look at South Korea, Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam, all of them used a similar policy. Policies were very, very similar. Now, let me say this. China, South Korea, Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam are all right in the same Asian region as Japan. Now, Japan has had an automobile sector, a powerful automobile sector, an advanced automobile sector for the last, many decades. And the question is, given their proximity to these countries, in other words, given how close Japan is to these countries, how is it that these countries prevented the mass dumping of vehicles, used vehicles in particular, into their markets? How were they able to protect their markets, to develop their markets from the onslaught that is happening to Africa with these mass importation? It's government policy. Government policy was set up in such a way that the local market was protected. Their policy was they wanted, and at some point in the future, they knew they were going to be manufacturing giants in the automobile space. And so they wanted to make sure and ensure that their markets were protected. Now, the government policy did something else that ensured their success. And that is, irrespective of these governments, these China, South Korea, Malaysia, Vietnam, and there are some other Asian countries as well, all of these countries ensured from a government policy perspective that all the government agencies, whether they are federal or national governments or they are state and local governments, all of these governments, when they purchase vehicles for use in government, some 70 to 80% of those vehicles had to be. Some 70 to 80% of those vehicles had to be locally made. What that did was it ensured not only were the markets protected, but what it did was it ensured that the local manufacturers had a steady stream of buyers. In other words, they got the capital from the government in an indirect way so they could improve and hone their craft, improve and hone the way their manufacturing processes so that they could compete. In addition, as I said, the markets were protected from the outside in a significant way. It's not that you couldn't import a vehicle. You could, but it would be very, very, very expensive. Now, it's safe to assume that in these countries, there were individuals who had connections to government ministers and legislators who wanted to import vehicles in large numbers and sell them to the local market. It's safe to assume that. But the government policy did not allow that. If someone wanted to get into the automobile space, they had to get into the manufacturing space. Let me say that again. If they wanted to get into the automobile space, they had to get into the manufacturing space. The governments and their policies weren't going to allow individuals, even if they're connected individuals, they were not going to allow those individuals to import cars in large numbers and kill the local industry. That is what Asian governments have done. African governments, being 54 of them, have no such policy. In fact, 54 African governments have 54 different policies. And the idea, again, it's to protect the market, but they did the secondary piece, which is to consume what they produced. African governments have not earmarked a specific 50, 60, 70% of the government vehicles that the governments are using to come from African manufacturers. They have not done that. So from a government policy perspective, they're destroying the African markets because you're allowing dumping and you are not also guaranteeing a certain amount of products for sale through government acquisition. So that is from a government policy perspective. We see how the Asian governments handle it, and we see how the African governments are handling it. And African governments are handling it very, very poorly. In fact, you're leading to the destruction of the African manufacturing. Even the same governments who gave these companies license to manufacture are not doing enough to protect the local market. And by local market, I mean the African continental market. I also want to talk about government policy. Every time a government policy is created, there are going to be winners and losers. It's going to affect different people in different ways, some positively, some negatively. And let me use an example. So let's say the Nigerian government, right, tomorrow morning decide or announce that they're going to make 10 power plants, 10 brand new efficient power plants. That policy is going to affect the country. It's going to affect a whole industry, the people who import generators, the people who service generators, the people who sell generators. All those people are going to be affected in a negative way. And I can assure you they're going to call up their government friends and whoever else they need to call to try to block this government policy. But let me say this, a government policy, to determine whether it's good or bad, you have to look at the overall effect. And those 10 power plants will cause an increase in manufacturing and production. That increase in manufacturing and production will also lead to an increase in salaries. The total benefit from those increase in production and salaries are going to far outweigh, it's going to far outweigh the losses that may come in terms of jobs, fixing generators, selling generators, not to mention all the foreign exchange that's going overseas to buy those generators, creating jobs overseas. All of that money would stay in, and that money can and should be repurposed into manufacturing so that everybody has a win-win. But government policy, generally speaking, has winners and losers. And overall, the African manufacturing, the African automobile manufacturers, the policy of the government should be to ensure that the African manufacturers and the African countries and the African people benefit from that. Now, so we see that African governments are allowing the dumping of new and used vehicle in the African market, suppressing competition and making it very difficult for African auto manufacturers to survive and thrive. Let's take a look at how bad this problem is. There's over 50 million vehicles in Africa. Some 90% of those vehicles are foreign made. That's hundreds of billions of dollars leaving Africa every single day. Billions upon billions upon billions of dollars are leaving Africa to buy new cars, to buy used cars being dumped in the African market, and to buy parts to repair these vehicles. Those hundreds of billions of dollars, if those cars were local, that money would be kept local. And as I mentioned earlier, the automobile sector in Africa employs people outside of, or should I say, subcontractors. So the net effect is millions of jobs. We African consumers are the cause of why millions of jobs are being exported. And we do that by our purchase. Government policy needs to change, but so is the action of every African consumer. And by the way, it's not just automobiles that this is happening in, but we're focused on automobiles today. Every single one of you need to think when you go to buy a vehicle, am I causing the young people, sometimes even family members, from not having a job? We send them to school and we say, go get a college degree, go get a university degree, go get a high school diploma. And they have done that. They have done their portion of it. But we now need to do our portion and buy the vehicles that are manufactured locally. The contract, or the secondary contract, will be with our African children, ensuring that when they graduate engineering school, when they graduate high school, they have an engineering job waiting for them in the African automobile manufacturing sector. At this point, I'd like to extend an invitation to the CEO of Kantanka in Ghana, the CEO of Innoson Manufacturing in Nigeria, and the CEO of Nord Automobiles in Nigeria, or to any African auto manufacturing CEO to come on this show. Please contact us using the email below, Africa Business Channel, africabusinesschannel@gmail.com. If you know of these people and can get access to them, please let them know that there's a standing invitation for them. We'd like to discuss the challenges of vehicle manufacturing in Africa and the job opportunities for African workers when they come on the show. So again, reach us at africabusinesschannel@gmail.com, and it's channel with one N. Thank you for watching.